At my stepsister's wedding, my father publicly disowned me because I said I wasn't interested in the family business. I quietly left without confronting him, but the next day, I started receiving calls from home. Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Dave from Newcastle, UK. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. The chandelier glittered like a constellation of captured stars, casting shards of light across the ballroom. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, a symphony of celebration that felt suffocating to me. My stepsister's wedding was a spectacle. White roses cascading from every table, a string quartet sawing away in the corner, and 200 guests in tailored suits and shimmering gowns, all orbiting my father like planets around a sun. He stood at the head table, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, his gray hair swept back like a lion's mane, commanding the room with every booming word. I lingered near the bar, nursing a whiskey, the ice clinking against the glass like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice cut through the din, and the crowd hushed, heads swiveling toward him. Tonight's not just about my darling daughter tying the knot. It's about legacy. He paused, letting the word hang, heavy as the humid August air pressing against the windows. The family business, Grayson Manufacturing, it's our blood, our steel, our future. And I'm proud to say, my son, he thrust a meaty hand toward me, will carry it forward. The room turned to me. Eyes like spotlights pinned me in place. I felt the weight of their expectation, the assumption I'd been dodging for years. My tie tightened around my throat like a noose. I set the whiskey down, the glass thudding against the polished wood, and stepped forward. The crowd parted, a sea of silk and cufflinks, their murmurs buzzing like static. My father's grin widened, all teeth and triumph, as I reached the microphone. He clapped me on the shoulder, hard enough to rattle my bones, and leaned in close. "Make me proud, boy," he muttered, his breath sour with bourbon. I gripped the mic, the metal cool against my palm, and scanned the faces, cousins, uncles, business partners, all waiting for me to parrot his script. My pulse thrummed in my ears, a war drum urging me to break free. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the hum. "But I'm not taking over the business." A gasp rippled through the room, sharp and sudden, like a blade slicing fabric. My father's grin froze, then cracked, his eyes narrowing to slits. "What did you say?" he growled, low enough that only I heard, his hand still clamped on my shoulder. "I'm not interested," I repeated, louder this time, the words echoing off the gilded walls. "I've got my own path." The silence was deafening, a vacuum sucking the air from the room. Then he erupted. "You ungrateful little." He yanked the mic from my hand, his face purpling as he turned to the crowd. "This boy thinks he's too good for what I built, for the sweat I poured into every bolt, every contract. You're no son of mine if you walk away from this." The words hit like a punch, each syllable a splinter under my skin. The guests shifted, some whispering, others staring wide-eyed, as if watching a car wreck unfold. My father's chest heaved, his fists clenched, daring me to fight back. But I didn't. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I met his glare, my jaw tight, and saw something flicker in his eyes. Rage, yes, but beneath it, a shadow of fear. He didn't know me, not really, and that was his first mistake. I turned, my shoes clicking against the marble floor, and walked toward the double doors. The crowd parted again, their murmurs swelling into a tide of speculation. Where's he going? What's he thinking? I didn't look back, not at the bride in her ivory gown, not at the relatives clutching their champagne flutes, not at my father, whose voice chased me like thunder. "You walk out, you're done. You hear me? Done." The doors swung shut behind me, muffling the chaos. Outside, the night was thick with humidity, the cicadas screaming in the trees. I loosened my tie, the fabric slipping through my fingers like a shed skin, and breathed deep. My phone buzzed in my pocket, once, twice, then a relentless stream. I ignored it, staring at the stars winking through the haze. He thought he'd broken me, humiliated me into submission. He had no idea what was coming. I slid into my car, the engine purring to life, and peeled out of the lot. The road stretched dark and endless before me, a ribbon of asphalt leading to a reckoning he'd never see until it was too late. The city skyline glittered beyond my apartment window, a jagged constellation of glass and steel that felt more like home than the wedding ballroom ever could. I stood there, barefoot on the hardwood, the cool floor grounding me as the night's humiliation replayed in my skull. My father's voice, "You're no son of mine," looped like a scratched record, each repetition stoking the embers smoldering in my chest. The whiskey I'd poured sat untouched on the counter, its amber glow catching the light. I didn't need it. Not tonight. Tonight, I needed clarity. My phone vibrated on the coffee table, a relentless buzz sawing through the silence. I glanced at the screen. 10 missed calls, a dozen texts, all from numbers I knew too well. "Aunt Claire, what's gotten into you?" "Cousin Mark, you really screwed up, man." Then him. My father. 3 voicemails, his name blazing in red like a warning flare. I tapped the first one, holding the phone at arm's length as his growl filled the room. "You think you can embarrass me like that and just slink off? You're a coward, boy. Call me back, or I swear." The message cut off, clipped by the limit. The next was sharper, angrier. "You don't get to walk away from this family. You owe me everything." By the third, his voice cracked, a hairline fracture in his bravado. "We need to talk. Now." I deleted them all, my thumb hovering over the screen as a new text popped up. "Please, son. Let's fix this." The word son twisted the knife he'd plunged hours ago. Too late for that. I tossed the phone onto the couch, its buzzing fading to a dull hum, and paced to the window. The city pulsed below, trucks rumbling, lights flickering, a machine I'd mastered while he was busy shouting at shadows. He didn't know. That was the kicker. Grayson Manufacturing, his precious empire of steel and sweat, wasn't his anymore. Not really. I'd spent years building my own company, a logistics juggernaut called Apex Transit, threading its tendrils through every industry he touched. And the crown jewel? Apex was his biggest customer, funneling millions into his coffers, keeping his factory humming. He'd never bothered to look beyond the contracts, never cared who signed the checks. Why would he? To him, I was just the quiet kid who'd never measure up. The ember flared into a flame. I snatched my phone and dialed my lawyer, pacing as it rang. "Evan," I said when he picked up, his groggy voice confirming I'd woken him. "I need you to do something." "Middle of the night?" Evan yawned. "This better be good." "It is." I stopped, staring at my reflection in the glass. Sharp jaw, shadowed eyes, a man my father wouldn't recognize. "Cancel the contract with Grayson Manufacturing. All of it. Effective immediately." Silence stretched on the line, thick and heavy. "You sure?" he finally asked, awake now. "That's a $10 million deal. Your dad's company." "He's not my dad anymore." I cut in, my voice ablade. "Do it. No notice, no explanation. Just pull the plug." Evan exhaled, a low whistle. "All right. It's your call. Papers will be filed by morning. You gonna tell me what's going on?" "Not yet." I hung up, the click echoing in the empty room. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the rush of it, the power surging through me like a live wire. I'd just lit a match under my father's world, and he wouldn't feel the heat until it was too late. I sank onto the couch, the leather creaking under me, and let my mind drift. The wedding flashed back, the stunned faces, the way his hand had tightened on my shoulder like he could crush my will with sheer force. He'd always ruled like that, a tyrant in a king's crown, expecting obedience. But I wasn't his soldier anymore. I'd built Apex from nothing. Nights hunched over spreadsheets, deals struck in backrooms. Every step a rebellion he'd never seen coming. And now? Now I'd watch him burn. The phone buzzed again, snapping me back. Another text from him. "You can't hide forever." I smirked, the corners of my mouth twitching. Hiding wasn't the plan. I leaned back, closing my eyes, imagining his face when the news hit, when his factory stuttered, when his empire cracked. He'd call again, angrier, then desperate, and I'd let it ring. A faint sound broke the quiet, a key turning in the lock. My eyes snapped open, heart kicking against my ribs. The door creaked, a shadow stretching across the floor. Someone was here. The factory office smelled like rust and stale coffee, a familiar tang that clung to Frank Grayson's skin after 30 years of grinding steel into profit. He slumped in his chair, the cracked leather groaning under his weight, and glared at the flickering fluorescent light overhead. It buzzed like a trapped fly, grating on nerves already frayed to snapping. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 a.m., its hands mocking him. Another sleepless night, another fight he couldn't win. Papers littered his desk, invoices, production schedules, a half-empty bottle of bourbon. He snatched it, took a swig, and winced as it burned down his throat. Not enough to dull the ache. The wedding replayed in his head, a reel he couldn't stop. His son, standing there, cool as ice, tossing aside everything Frank had built. "I'm not interested," he'd said, like it was nothing, like the factory wasn't the blood in their veins. Frank's fist clenched, knuckles whitening. He'd raised that boy, fed him, put a roof over his head, and for what? To be humiliated in front of 200 people, their whispers chasing him like wolves? He slammed the bottle down, amber sloshing onto a stack of overdue bills. Ungrateful little bastard. The phone rang, shrill and insistent, slicing through the haze. He snatched it up, barking. "What?" "Mr. Grayson, it's Linda from accounting." Her voice trembled, thin as a reed. "I just got a call. Apex Transit canceled their contract. All of it. No warning." Frank's gut twisted, a cold fist squeezing his insides. "What the hell are you talking about? Apex is 40% of our orders. They can't just—" "They did," she cut in, rare boldness cracking her usual meekness. "Email came through an hour ago. Effective immediately. We're screwed, Frank." He hung up without a word, his breath ragged. Apex Transit, his golden goose, the client that kept the lights on, the one he'd bragged about to every suit at the wedding. He shoved the papers aside, digging for the latest contract, his thick fingers fumbling. There it was, $10 million a year, signed and sealed. He'd never met the owner, some faceless exec, he figured, too busy counting cash to visit the floor. Didn't matter. They'd been steady, reliable, until now. Damn it. He hurled the contract across the room, pages fluttering like wounded birds. His chest heaved as he stormed to the window, staring out at the factory floor. The machine sat silent, hulking shadows in the dim light, a kingdom he'd forged from nothing. He'd started with one press and a loan he couldn't pay, clawing his way up while his wife walked out and his kids grew up resenting him. This was his legacy, and now it was crumbling. Why? Why now? He grabbed the phone again, dialing his operations manager. "Pete, get in here. Now." 10 minutes later, Pete shuffled in, tie loose, eyes bleary. "Boss, it's late. Shut it," Frank snapped, thrusting a finger at him. Apex pulled out. "I want answers. Call their rep, lean on him, figure out what's going on." Pete rubbed his neck, hesitant. "Tried already. Line's dead. No response. It's like they vanished." "Then dig deeper," Frank roared, slamming his fist on the desk. A pencil rolled off, clattering to the floor. "Get the lawyers, pull the filings, find out who's behind this. I don't care what it takes." Pete nodded and scurried out, leaving Frank alone with the buzzing light and his racing pulse. He sank back, rubbing his temples. This wasn't random. It couldn't be. The timing, right after the wedding, right after his son's stunt, gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't pull. But no, that was crazy. The boy was a dreamer, not a player. Still, the thought lingered, a shadow creeping closer. Hours later, the door creaked open. Frank jolted upright as his lawyer, Tom, stepped in, a manila folder clutched in his bony hands. His face was pale, lips tight, like he'd seen a ghost. "Frank," he said, voice low, "you need to see this." "What?" Frank growled, snatching the folder. He flipped it open, scanning the corporate filings for Apex Transit. His eyes locked on the owner's name, bold and black, Evan James Grayson. His son. His breath stopped, the room tilting as the truth crashed down. The bourbon bottle slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, glass exploding like a gunshot. And then the lights went out. The morning sun sliced through the blinds of my office, casting razor-thin shadows across the polished oak desk. I leaned back in my chair, the leather sighing under me, and watched the city sprawl beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Towers of glass and ambition stretched to the horizon, a chessboard I'd learned to play long before my father knew the game had started. My laptop hummed softly, its screen glowing with the latest Apex transit reports. Shipments up 12%, new contracts in Singapore, a fleet expansion greenlit for next quarter. I'd built this, brick by invisible brick, while he was busy shouting at welders and signing my name to a future I never wanted. My assistant, Mara, knocked once before slipping in, her heels clicking like a metronome. She dropped a stack of folders on my desk, her dark eyes flicking to mine. "Cancellations processed," she said, voice crisp. "Grayson Manufacturing's out of the loop as of 6 a.m. Lawyers confirmed it's airtight." Good. I didn't look up. Flipping open the top folder, projections for rerouting Apex's business to a rival supplier. Any noise from their end? Not yet. She paused, tapping a pen against her palm. But I'd bet my bonus they're scrambling. You sure you don't want to leak a reason? Keep the rumor mill spinning. I smirked, the corner of my mouth twitching. Let them guess. Silence is louder. She nodded, a ghost of a smile crossing her face, and left me to the quiet. Silence was my weapon, always had been. My father thrived on noise, on bluster, filling every room with his growl until you couldn't hear yourself think. I learned early to fade into the background, to watch, to wait. He called it weakness once, back when I was 16, hunched over a laptop in his factory break room. "Stop tinkering with that junk," he barked, tossing a wrench at my feet. "Real men make things, not numbers." I'd picked up the wrench, handed it back, and said nothing. That night, I'd coded my first shipping algorithm, the seed of Apex, while he drank himself to sleep. The memory stung, a barb lodged deep. I pushed it down, focusing on the present. Grayson Manufacturing was bleeding now, 40% of its revenue gone in a single stroke. I could picture it, the factory floor stalling, workers milling around, my father's voice booming threats at shadows. He'd dig, of course. He wasn't stupid, just blind. How long until he found out? Hours. Days. The thought sent a jolt through me. Not fear, but something sharper, electric. Anticipation. I stood, stretching, and crossed to the window. Below, the streets crawled with life. Trucks hauling Apex cargo, cabs weaving through traffic, a pulse I controlled without ever raising my voice. I'd spent a decade building this. Nights of black coffee and red-eye flights. Deals struck in dive bars and boardrooms alike. No loans, no handouts, just me and a hunger he'd never understand. He thought he'd disown me at that wedding, but I'd cut the cord years ago. The contract cancellation wasn't revenge, it was proof. My phone buzzed on the desk, a single text lighting the screen. "Evan, my lawyer. He's asking questions." Lawyers sniffing around Apex filings. I stared at it, my pulse kicking up a notch. "So it begins." I typed back, "Let them find it." No point hiding now. The truth was a grenade, pin already pulled. I set the phone down, imagining his face when he saw my name on those papers, the moment his empire cracked under the weight of his own arrogance. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Mara again, her face tighter this time. "Courier just dropped this off," she said, holding out a plain envelope. No label, no return address. No idea who sent it. I took it, the paper rough against my fingers, and slid it open. Inside was a single sheet, typed in block letters. "You can't bury me that easy." No signature, but I didn't need one. His voice bled through every word, gruff and unyielding, a taunt from a man who didn't know he'd already lost. My jaw tightened, a flicker of heat rising in my chest. I crumpled the note, tossing it into the trash. "Everything okay?" Mara asked, hovering. "Perfect," I said, my voice flat. "Get me the latest on Grayson's suppliers. I want to know who's jumping ship." She nodded and vanished, leaving me alone with the city's hum. He thought this was a fight he could win with threats and bluster. He was wrong. I turned back to the window, the sun climbing higher, and felt the game shift beneath my feet. Checkmate was coming, and he'd never see the board. The clock on my office wall ticked past 4 p.m., its rhythm swallowed by the distant thrum of the city below. I stood at the window, hands clasped behind me, watching storm clouds bruise the horizon, gray and heavy, like the weight settling in my gut. Apex's latest figures glowed on my laptop, profits climbing, Grayson Manufacturing's collapse a footnote in my victory. I should have felt triumphant, but the crumpled note from this morning, "You can't bury me that easy," gnawed at me, a splinter I couldn't ignore. He was coming. I knew it like I knew the sound of his boots on gravel, a cadence etched into my bones. The door slammed open, the bang echoing off the glass walls. I didn't flinch, didn't turn, just watched his reflection ripple across the window pane. Frank Grayson filled the room like a thunderclap, his broad frame heaving, his gray hair wild from the wind. He smelled of sweat and motor oil, a factory ghost haunting my sterile world. "You little snake," he snarled, his voice a gravel pit, rough and deep. "You think you can pull this and just sit pretty?" I turned slowly, meeting his glare. His eyes were bloodshot, wild, twin furnaces burning with rage and something else, fear, maybe, buried deep. "Good to see you too, Dad," I said, my tone flat, a blade wrapped in silk. "You didn't knock. Don't you dad me." He stormed forward, boots thudding on the hardwood, and stopped inches from my desk, fists balled like sledgehammers. "Apex Transit? Yours? You've been bleeding me dry, playing me like some chump, and now you cut the cord? You're a traitor." I leaned against the desk, arms crossed, letting his words crash over me. "Traitor?" I echoed, tilting my head. "That's rich, coming from the man who disowned me in front of half the city. You threw me out first." His face purpled, veins bulging at his temples. "I gave you everything. That factory, my factory, it's your blood, your name. And you spit on it like it's trash." "No," I said, stepping closer, my voice low, steady. "You gave me orders. I built Apex. No handouts, no Grayson steel, just me. You never saw it because you never looked." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that ricocheted off the walls. "Oh, I see now. Little king in his tower, thinking he's outsmarted me. You're nothing without me, boy. Nothing." He jabbed a finger at my chest, close enough I could feel the heat radiating off him. I didn't move, didn't blink, just held his stare until his hand faltered, hovering there like a stalled engine. "You're wrong," I said, stepping past him to the window, forcing him to turn. "Grayson Manufacturing's dying because of you, because you clung to it like a drowning man to a raft. Apex kept it afloat. My money, my contracts. And you didn't even know." He froze, his breath hitching, a bull caught mid-charge. I turned back, watching the realization sink in, his jaw slackening as the pieces clicked. "You're lying," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He knew. The filings, the numbers, he'd seen them, and they'd gutted him. "Am I?" I pulled a file from my desk, tossing it at his feet. It landed with a thud, pages spilling, contracts, invoices, proof of Apex's lifeline to his world. 40% of your revenue, gone. Suppliers are bailing, creditors circling. You're done unless I say otherwise." He stared at the papers, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. Then he lunged, snatching my collar, his grip iron tight. "You smug bastard," he hissed, his face inches from mine, bourbon and fury on his breath. "I'll drag you down with me before I let you win." I grabbed his wrist, twisting free with a force he didn't expect, and shoved him back. He stumbled, catching himself on the desk, shock flashing across his face. "You're already down," I said, my voice cutting through the air. "But I'm not here to bury you, not yet. Sell me the company. Fair price, clean break. Walk away while you still can." His laugh was bitter, jagged. "Walk away? From my life's work? To you?" He straightened, towering again, his shadow swallowing the light. "I'd rather burn it to the ground." "Then burn," I said, stepping closer, unflinching. "But you'll do it alone." He glared, fists trembling, a volcano on the edge of eruption. For a moment, I thought he'd swing, thought I'd feel the crack of his knuckles, the way I had as a kid. But he didn't. He turned, slow and deliberate, and stormed out, the door slamming so hard the frame rattled. His boots echoed down the hall, fading into silence. I exhaled, the tension bleeding from my shoulders, and glanced at the storm outside. Lightning flickered, a warning. He wasn't done. Not yet. Rain lashed the factory windows, streaking the grime-streaked panes like tears on a weathered face. Frank Grayson sat alone in his office, the bourbon bottle empty now, its shards glinting on the floor from last night's rage. The room was a tomb, dark, stale, the air thick with the ghosts of 30 years. The fluorescent light had given up hours ago, leaving only the gray glow of the storm outside to illuminate the chaos. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, a cracked photo frame of him and his son, back when the boy still smiled. He hadn't touched it since the blackout, hadn't dared look at that frozen moment. Not now. The factory floor beyond the glass was a graveyard. Machines loomed like silent sentinels, their hum replaced by the drip, drip, drip of a leaking roof. No clatter of steel, no shouts of workers, just the wind howling through cracked skylights, a banshee mourning what he'd lost. He pressed his palms to his temples, trying to squeeze out the headache pounding like a jackhammer. Apex's cancellation had hit like a sledgehammer, and the cracks were spreading. Suppliers called hourly, voices tight with panic. "Where's our payment, Frank?" While the bank left voicemails he couldn't bear to hear. 40% of his revenue, gone overnight, and the rest bleeding out fast. He'd stormed out of his son's office yesterday, chest heaving with fury, vowing to fight. Burn it to the ground, he'd spat, and meant it. But now, slumped in the dark, the bravado felt hollow. He built grace in manufacturing with his bare hands, nights welding until his fingers blistered, days haggling with clients who'd laughed at his cheap suit. It was his empire, his proof he wasn't the nobody his own father had called him. And now? Now it was slipping through his fingers, and the one pulling the strings was the boy he'd raised. Frank staggered to his feet, boots crunching glass, and grabbed the phone. "Pete," he rasped when the line picked up. "Tell me you've got something." "Anything." A long pause, then Pete's voice, weary and thin. "It's bad, boss. 2 more clients jumped ship this morning. Heard about Apex, figured we're done. Bank's freezing the line of credit unless we cover the overdraft by Friday. We're hemorrhaging." Frank's grip tightened, the plastic creaking. "Fix it. Call in favors, lean on somebody, do your damn job." "I've tried." Pete snapped, a rare break in his loyalty. "Nobody's touching us. They smell blood, Frank. You're on your own." The line went dead. Frank hurled the phone at the wall, the crack swallowed by a thunderclap outside. On his own. The words sank into him, cold and final. He stumbled to the window, staring at the skeletal presses below. He'd fired half the crew yesterday, couldn't pay them, couldn't look them in the eye. The rest milled around, waiting for a miracle he didn't have. He'd screamed at them to keep working, but what was the point? No orders, no cash, just a sinking ship and a captain too stubborn to jump. His son's voice echoed in his skull, "Sell me the company. Fair price, clean break." He'd laughed it off then, spitting in the face of that calm, cutting offer. But now, with the walls closing in, it gnawed at him. Sell? To the boy who'd gutted him? The thought was acid, burning through his pride. Yet the alternative, watching it all collapse, decades of sweat reduced to a bankruptcy filing, twisted the knife deeper. He pressed his forehead to the glass, the cold seeping into his skin, and saw his reflection, haggard, hollow, a man staring into the abyss. A memory flickered, his son at 10, trailing him through the factory, wide-eyed as Frank explained the presses. "One day, this'll be yours," he'd said, ruffling the boy's hair. The kid had nodded, quiet even then, but there'd been a spark in his eyes. When had it died? When had Frank stopped seeing him? He shook his head, shoving the thought down. Too late for that. Too late for everything. The door creaked open. Frank turned, sluggish, as Tom, his lawyer, stepped in, rain dripping from his coat. "Frank," he said, voice low, "I've got calls coming in, creditors, buyers sniffing around the carcass. You've got one play left." Frank's laugh was a dry rasp. "Yeah? What's that?" "Sell to him," Tom said, unflinching. "He's offering fair market value. You keep your name off the auction block. Walk away with something." Frank stared, his chest tightening. Walk away. The words tasted like ash. He looked past Tom, out at the storm, and felt the fight drain from him, a slow bleed he couldn't stop. "Call him," he muttered, turning away. "Tell him he wins." Tom nodded and left, the door clicking shut. Frank sank to the floor, the rain's rhythm his only company, and waited for the end. The factory smelled different now, less like rust and desperation, more like stillness, a held breath waiting to exhale. I stood on the catwalk overlooking the floor, my footsteps ringing off the steel grates, the only sound in a space that once roared with life. The machines loomed below, silent giants coated in a thin layer of dust, their shadows stretching long and jagged in the late afternoon light streaming through the skylights. Rain had scrubbed the air clean overnight, leaving a crisp edge that sharpened every detail. The chipped paint on the presses, the faded Grayson Manufacturing logo on the wall, the faint hum of possibility beneath the quiet. It was mine now. All of it. I'd signed the papers that morning, a stack of legalese delivered by Tom, my father's lawyer, in a sterile conference room downtown. He'd barely met my eyes. His voice clipped as he slid the folder across the table. "It's done," he'd said. "Frank's out. Congratulations." No handshake. No sentiment. Just the scratch of my pen and the weight of victory settling on my shoulders. I didn't ask where my father was. Didn't need to. His absence screamed louder than any words he could have thrown at me. I descended the stairs, my boots thudding against the metal, and crossed the floor, tracing a path I hadn't walked in years. The last time I'd been here, I was a kid, trailing him as he barked orders, his voice drowning out the clang of steel. I'd clutched a notebook then, scribbling ideas he'd never read, routes, efficiencies, dreams he'd called foolish. Now, those dreams owned this place. Apex Transit would gut it, retool it, turn it into a hub for my empire. His legacy, reshaped by mine. I paused at a workbench, running my fingers over a rusted wrench left behind. It was heavy, cold, a relic of his world. I could still hear him. Real men make things, not numbers. His growl echoing from that long-ago night when I'd chosen a different path. I'd taken that wrench from him once, handed it back without a word, and walked away. I dropped it now, the clatter sharp against the silence, and kept moving. No looking back. The office door hung ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. I pushed it open, stepping into his domain, or what was left of it. The chaos was gone, cleaned up by someone, but the scars remained. A dent in the wall where he'd thrown something. A cracked chair tipped on its side, the faint whiff of bourbon lingering in the air. His desk sat empty, save for a single photo frame lying face down. I picked it up, turning it over. Me and him, a decade ago, standing by the main press. I was small, grinning, my hair a mess. He was proud, his arms slung around me, a king in his castle. My throat tightened, a pang I hadn't expected. I set it down gently, leaving it as it was. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the factory in gold and shadow. I walked the perimeter, my phone buzzing in my pocket. Mara, probably, with updates on the transition. I ignored it, needing this moment alone. The deal was done, the numbers final, fair market value, just as I'd offered. He'd taken it, walked away with enough to live on, but not enough to start over. Not that he would. Frank Grayson didn't bend, he broke. I wondered where he was now, holed up in that old house on the edge of town, staring at the walls, or already gone, chasing some new fight he couldn't win. I'd never know. He hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't faced me since the showdown. The silence was his surrender and mine. I stopped at the loading bay, the roll-up doors rusted shut, and looked out at the empty lot. No trucks, no workers, just a stretch of cracked asphalt glinting in the fading light. A breeze kicked up, tugging at my jacket, and I felt the shift, the weight of what I'd done. I'd won, not just the factory, but the freedom he'd tried to chain me to. Apex was my legacy now, built from scratch, no shadows to escape. Yet the victory tasted bittersweet, laced with something I couldn't name. Loss maybe, not for him, but for what we might have been. I turned back, the factory a silhouette against the sky, and started toward my car. The engine purred to life, a sound of control, of forward motion. As I pulled away, the building shrank in the rear view, a monument to a war I'd ended. He was gone, and I was here. That was enough. For now. And that's the story, a story of pride, power, and the price of legacy. Did I outsmart him, or did he lose himself? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I read every one. If you loved this ride, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next tale. Stay tuned, and let's keep the story going together.